The rain fell in sheets across the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital in Richmond, Virginia, turning the early morning into a grey watercolor of headlights and umbrellas. Marcus Cole sat in his pickup truck, watching the droplets race down his windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel, even though the engine was off. He'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, trying to convince himself to go inside. At 42, Marcus still carried himself with the rigid posture of his former profession. 20 years as a Navy SEAL had left him with a body that refused to relax, even when his mind desperately wanted to. The scars on his forearms told stories he never shared, and the slight limp in his left leg was a permanent reminder of a night in Fallujah that still visited him in his dreams. He pulled out his phone and looked at the text message from his sister again. "Dad's getting worse. The doctors say it's time to discuss options. Please come, Marcus." "He's been asking for you." Marcus closed his eyes and let out a long breath. He hadn't seen his father in almost 3 years, not since the funeral for his mother, when harsh words had been exchanged and old wounds had been torn open like stitches ripped from healing skin. Walter Cole was 94 years old, a Korean War veteran who had served with distinction in the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir. He'd been a hard man all his life, harder still after he came home from the war, with memories that he drowned in whiskey and silence. Marcus had spent his childhood trying to earn his father's approval, and his adulthood trying to understand why it never came. But now, Walter was dying. Congestive heart failure, his sister had said. Maybe a few weeks left, maybe less. Marcus finally opened his truck door and stepped out into the rain. He didn't bother with an umbrella. The cold water on his face felt like penance. The hospital lobby was bright and sterile, with the artificial cheerfulness that all hospitals seem to cultivate. A large painting of a sunset hung over the reception desk, as if to remind everyone that beauty still existed somewhere beyond these walls. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a pale, washed-out glow that made everyone look slightly ill. A family sat in the corner of the waiting area, huddled together in shared grief. A young mother tried to comfort a crying child, while an elderly man stared blankly at the floor. These were the sounds and sights of every hospital Marcus had ever been in, the universal language of waiting and worry. "I'm here to see Walter Cole," Marcus said to the receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes and a forced smile. "He's in the long-term care wing. Room 417, she said, barely looking up from her computer. Visiting hours end at 8. Marcus nodded and made his way to the elevator. As he waited for the doors to open, he noticed a bulletin board covered with flyers and announcements. One caught his eye. "Patient rights. You have the right to be treated with dignity and respect." He wondered how many people in this building actually upheld that promise. The long-term care wing was on the 4th floor, a place where people came to wait for the end. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and something else, something that Marcus recognized from his years of service. It was the smell of bodies giving up. The walls were lined with handrails, the floors polished to a shine that reflected the harsh overhead lights. Doors stood open to reveal glimpses of lives in their final chapters. An old woman watching television alone, a man sleeping with his mouth open, a room full of flowers that couldn't mask the smell of sickness. He found room 417 at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see a thin figure lying in the bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical indifference. Marcus pushed the door open and stepped inside. Walter Cole looked nothing like the man Marcus remembered. His father had always been big, broad-shouldered, with hands like baseball mitts and a voice that could shake windows. But the man in the bed was small, shrunken, his skin hanging loose on his bones like a suit that no longer fit. His eyes, though, his eyes were the same, sharp and blue and filled with the same stubborn fire that had burned in them for 94 years. "Took you long enough," Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper but still carrying that familiar edge. "Thought you might not come." Marcus pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed. "I'm here, Dad. Your sister tell you about the heart?" "She told me." Walter nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the window where the rain continued to fall. "Funny thing, dying. Spent my whole life trying to avoid it. Bullets in Korea, car accidents, that time with the chainsaw. Now here I am, getting taken out by my own heart. Seems like a joke." "How are they treating you here?" Marcus asked, not knowing what else to say. Walter's jaw tightened. "Fine. They're treating me fine." But there was something in his voice, something that Marcus recognized. It was the same tone his father had used when Marcus was a kid and asked about the war, the tone that said there were things he wasn't saying. "Dad, if something's wrong—" "Nothing's wrong," Walter cut him off. "I said they're treating me fine. Now tell me about yourself. You still doing that security work?" Marcus let it go for now. "Yeah, private consulting. Mostly corporate stuff. Boring. It pays the bills. That what you want on your tombstone? He paid the bills." Marcus almost smiled. Even at 94, even dying in a hospital bed, his father still knew how to push his buttons. "What would you put on yours?" Walter was quiet for a moment. He tried. That's all any of us can say in the end. He tried. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain and the beeping machines. It was the most peaceful they'd been in the same room since Marcus was 12 years old. A nurse came in around 6 o'clock to check Walter's vitals. She was middle-aged, with greying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Her name tag read, Patricia Hendricks, RN. "Time for your medication, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice flat and professional. Walter's entire demeanor changed. His body tensed, and Marcus saw something flash across his father's face that he'd never seen before. Fear. "I don't want it," Walter said. "Makes me sick." "Doctor's orders," Patricia replied, already preparing the pills. "Open up. I said I don't want it. It makes me nauseous. Can't keep anything down." Patricia sighed, the sound carrying a weight of annoyance that seemed practiced. "Mr. Cole, we do this every time. The medication is necessary. Now take it, or I'll have to note your non-compliance in your chart." Marcus watched the exchange with growing unease. There was something wrong here, something in the way the nurse spoke to his father, something in the way Walter seemed to shrink in her presence. "Maybe you could talk to the doctor," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm. "If the medication is making him sick, there might be alternatives." Patricia turned to him as if noticing him for the first time. Her eyes were cold, assessing. "And you are?" "His son." "Well, his son. The doctor has prescribed this medication for a reason. I suggest you let us do our jobs." She turned back to Walter and held out the pills. "Take them. Now." Walter took the pills with trembling hands and swallowed them, his eyes avoiding Marcus's gaze. Patricia made a note on her tablet, then left the room without another word. After she was gone, Marcus leaned forward. "Dad, what the hell was that?" "Nothing. She's just doing her job." "That wasn't nothing. You were scared of her." Walter's eyes finally met his son's, and in them, Marcus saw something that broke his heart. His father, the man who had survived the Chosun Reservoir, the man who had never backed down from anything in his life, was afraid. "There are things you don't understand," Walter said quietly, "things that happen here when the families aren't around. It's better not to make waves." "What kind of things?" But Walter just shook his head and closed his eyes. "I'm tired, son. Let me sleep." Marcus sat there for a long time, watching his father's chest rise and fall, his mind churning with questions and a growing sense of dread. Something was very wrong at Mercy General Hospital, and Marcus Cole was going to find out what it was. He left the hospital that night with a promise to return the next day. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with moisture and the smell of wet asphalt. As he walked to his truck, he passed an ambulance parked near the emergency entrance. 2 paramedics were loading a gurney, and on it lay an old man, his face pale and slack, his eyes staring at nothing. Another veteran, Marcus thought, noticing the faded navy tattoo on the man's forearm. Another old soldier, dying alone. He drove to his hotel through streets that glistened with reflected lights, his mind replaying the scene in his father's room over and over. The fear in Walter's eyes, the cold dismissiveness of the nurse, the way his father had said things that happen here when the families aren't around. Marcus had spent 20 years in some of the most dangerous places on earth, and he had learned to trust his instincts. Right now, every instinct he had was screaming that something was terribly wrong. He checked into a Holiday Inn near the hospital, a nondescript room with a bed that was too soft and curtains that didn't quite block out the light from the parking lot. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his father and the life they'd never quite managed to build together. Walter Cole had been a hard man to love. He'd come back from Korea with demons that he'd never been able to exorcise, and he'd taken those demons out on everyone around him. Marcus's childhood had been a minefield of his father's moods, never knowing when the next explosion would come. But he was still his father, and whatever was happening at that hospital, Marcus was going to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the hospital early, before official visiting hours. He'd learned long ago that the best reconnaissance happens when people aren't expecting you. The long-term care wing was quieter in the morning, with fewer staff and fewer visitors. Marcus walked slowly down the hallway, taking note of everything: the layout of the rooms, the locations of the nurses' stations, the faces of the staff members he passed. He paused by an open door and saw an elderly woman sitting alone in her bed, staring out the window at the grey morning sky. Her breakfast tray sat untouched on the table beside her. She looked up when she noticed him, and her eyes were filled with such loneliness that Marcus felt his heart constrict. "Good morning," he said. "Is it?" she replied, her voice soft and weary. "They all look the same from here." Marcus wanted to say something comforting, but what could he say? He nodded and moved on, adding another mental note to the growing list of things that troubled him about this place. He stopped outside his father's room when he heard voices inside. One was Walter's, weak but defiant. The other was a woman's, sharp and angry. "I told you to keep your mouth shut, old man. Nobody cares what you think you saw." "I know what I saw. You can't treat people like that. It's not right." "Not right? Let me tell you what's not right. You complaining about every little thing, making my job harder. You think anyone's going to believe a senile old man over me?" Marcus felt his blood run cold. He knew he should wait, should gather more information before acting. But then he heard a sound that sent him through the door like a bullet. The sharp crack of flesh hitting flesh. He burst into the room to find Patricia Hendricks standing over his father's bed, her hand still raised. Walter's cheek was red, already beginning to swell, and there was blood on his lip where it had split against his teeth. "Oh, what the hell did you just do?" Marcus's voice was low, controlled, but there was a fury in it that made Patricia take a step backward. "This is none of your business." He was being combative. "I had to restrain him." "That's a lie." Marcus moved toward her, and she retreated further, her back hitting the wall. "I heard everything. You hit a 94-year-old man because he complained about your treatment of patients. You don't know what you're talking about. I'll call security." "Go ahead. Call them. And while you're at it, call the police. Because what I just witnessed is felony assault on an elderly person." Patricia's face went white, then red with anger. "You think anyone's going to believe you? Your father is confused. He has dementia. It's all documented. My father doesn't have dementia, and I have a very clear memory of what I just saw and heard." He pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is Marcus Cole. The date is March 15th, 2024. I'm in room 417 of Mercy General Hospital. I just witnessed Patricia Hendricks, a registered nurse at this facility, strike my father, Walter Cole, a 94-year-old Korean War veteran, across the face. His cheek is red and swelling, and his lip is bleeding." He turned the camera to his father, who was sitting up in bed now, his eyes wet but his jaw set with the stubborn pride that Marcus remembered. "Dad, Can you tell me what happened? Walter looked at the camera, then at his son. She hit me. I told her I saw her taking money from Mr. Patterson's wallet last week, the man in 412. She's been stealing from patients. And when I said I was going to tell someone, she hit me. Marcus turned the camera back to Patricia, who was now backed against the wall, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. You have anything to say? This is illegal. You can't record me without my consent. Virginia is a one-party consent state. I'm consenting to this recording. Now I suggest you leave this room before I forget my training and do something we'll both regret. Patricia pushed past him and fled the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Marcus ended the recording and knelt beside his father's bed. Are you okay, Dad? Walter reached out and took his son's hand, his grip still surprisingly strong. You came back. I told you I would. I didn't think you would, not after everything. Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes, an unfamiliar sensation. Dad, what's been going on here? How long has this been happening? Walter was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Months, maybe longer. It's not just her. There's others. They know the ones who don't have family, the ones no one visits. They treat them like animals. I've seen things, son. Terrible things. Why didn't you tell anyone? Who would I tell? The other nurses, the doctors? They don't care. We're just old people waiting to die. We don't matter to anyone. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. You matter to me, Dad. And I'm going to make sure everyone responsible for this is held accountable. Over the next several hours, Marcus gathered evidence. He talked to other patients on the floor, veterans like his father, men and women who had served their country and were now being abused by the very people meant to care for them. There was Eugene Patterson in room 412, an 88-year-old Army veteran who confirmed that money had been taken from his wallet. He showed Marcus the bruises on his arms where he'd been grabbed too roughly. Eugene had been a sergeant in Vietnam, had led men through the jungles of the Mekong Delta, and now he was being robbed and beaten by people who were supposed to protect him. I told my grandson, Eugene said, his voice shaking with humiliation and anger. He said he'd look into it, but nothing happened. Nobody listens to old men anymore. I'm listening, Marcus said, and I promise you, this is going to stop. There was Mary Whitmore in room 408, a 91-year-old former Army nurse who served in Vietnam. She spoke in a trembling voice about being left in soiled sheets for hours, about being denied pain medication, about being called names that made her cry. I spent my life taking care of soldiers, Mary said, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. I held their hands while they died. I wrote letters to their mothers, and this is how I'm treated at the end? Like I'm nothing? Like I don't deserve basic human dignity? Marcus held her hand and listened, his heart breaking with every word. And there was Robert Chen in room 420, a 90-year-old Marine who had fought in Korea alongside Marcus's father. Robert could barely speak anymore, but his daughter, Linda, had been documenting suspicious injuries for months. She'd complained to the hospital administration, but nothing had been done. They told me my father was confused, Linda said, showing Marcus photographs of bruises on her father's arms and legs. They said he was falling out of bed. But my father was a Marine. He survived Incheon. He doesn't just fall out of bed. Marcus recorded everything, careful to get consent from each patient or family member. He was building a case, and he intended for it to be airtight. By late afternoon, he had enough evidence to take to the authorities. But he also knew that going to the police wasn't enough. He'd seen too many cases like this get buried in bureaucracy, dismissed as misunderstandings, settled quietly to protect institutional reputations. No, Marcus thought, this needed to be exposed, publicly, completely, in a way that couldn't be ignored. He made a phone call to an old friend, a journalist named Sarah Mitchell, who worked for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. They'd known each other for years, had worked together on a story about veteran homelessness that had led to real policy changes. Sarah, it's Marcus. I need your help. Marcus Cole, calling me out of the blue. This must be serious. It is. I'm at Mercy General Hospital. My father is a patient here, and I've uncovered systematic abuse of elderly patients, most of them veterans. I have video evidence, witness statements, documentation going back months. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus, if what you're saying is true, this is a massive story. It's true. I've seen it with my own eyes. A nurse slapped my 94-year-old father across the face this morning, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I can be there in 2 hours. Don't do anything until I get there. I'll be here. Marcus ended the call and returned to his father's room. Walter was asleep, his face peaceful despite the bruise that was now darkening on his cheek. Marcus sat in the chair beside the bed and watched him breathe, thinking about all the years they'd lost to anger and misunderstanding. He thought about his mother, Dorothy, who had died 3 years ago. She had been the bridge between Marcus and his father, the one who translated Walter's silence into love and smoothed over the sharp edges of their relationship. Without her, they'd had no way to reach each other, but maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe this, as terrible as it was, could be the thing that finally brought them together. Marcus was pulled from his thoughts by a knock at the door. He turned to see a man in his 50s standing in the doorway, wearing an expensive suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Cole, I'm Richard Harmon, the hospital administrator. May I have a word with you?" Marcus stood up slowly. "About what?" "I understand there was an incident this morning. I want to assure you that we take any complaints about patient care very seriously." "An incident? Is that what you're calling it when one of your nurses assaults an elderly patient?" Harmon's smile flickered. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Patricia Hendricks is one of our most experienced nurses. She has an exemplary record. Her record is about to get a lot less exemplary. I have video evidence of her striking my father. Mr. Cole, I would strongly advise you to be careful about making accusations. Defamation lawsuits can be very costly." Marcus felt a cold smile spread across his face. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Harmon?" "Not at all. I'm simply suggesting that we handle this matter privately, through proper channels. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that satisfies everyone." "An arrangement? You mean a payoff?" "I mean a resolution that protects everyone's interests, including your father's continued care." The implication was clear, and it made Marcus's blood boil. "Let me be clear about something, Mr. Harmon. I spent 20 years as a Navy SEAL. I've faced down terrorists, drug cartels, and some of the most dangerous people on the planet. Do you really think I'm going to be intimidated by a man in a cheap suit threatening my father?" Harmon's facade cracked, revealing the anger beneath. "You don't know what you're getting into, Mr. Cole. This hospital has powerful friends. We can make things very difficult for you and your family." "Then I suggest you start making things difficult, because I'm not backing down, and by this time tomorrow, the whole world is going to know what's been happening in this hospital." Harmon stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. Marcus pulled out his phone and called his sister, Rebecca. "Becky, I need you to get down here. Something's happening, and I need you to be with Dad." "What's going on, Marcus? You're scaring me." "I'll explain everything when you get here. Just hurry." He spent the next hour making arrangements. He called a security consultant he knew and hired 2 men to stand guard outside his father's room. He contacted a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases and sent her all the evidence he'd gathered. And he made sure that his recordings were backed up to multiple cloud locations where they couldn't be erased. Rebecca arrived around 5 o'clock, her face pale with worry. She was 4 years younger than Marcus, with their mother's soft features and their father's stubborn chin. They embraced in the hallway, and Marcus felt some of the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. "Tell me everything," she said. So he did. He told her about the nurse, about the slap, about the other patients he'd talked to. He showed her the video and watched as her expression shifted from disbelief to horror to rage. "That woman hit our father," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "She actually hit him. And she's been doing it to others for months, maybe years. The whole system is corrupt, Becky. From the nurses to the administration. They've been preying on people who can't fight back. What are we going to do? We're going to fight back. I've got a journalist coming, a lawyer on standby, and evidence that can't be ignored. But I need you here with Dad while I handle things. Can you do that? Rebecca nodded, her jaw set with determination. I'm not leaving his side. When Sarah Mitchell arrived, Marcus met her in the hospital lobby and spent an hour bringing her up to speed. She listened with the focused intensity of a journalist who knows she's onto something big. This is exactly the kind of story that needs to be told, she said when he finished. But I have to warn you, Marcus. Going public with this is going to make you a lot of enemies. Hospitals, insurance companies, medical associations, they all have a vested interest in keeping things like this quiet. I don't care about making enemies. I care about making sure this never happens to another veteran, another elderly person, another human being who deserves dignity and respect. Sarah nodded slowly. Okay, let me start making some calls. I have contacts at the State Health Department, at the VA, at the FBI Elder Abuse Unit. If what you've told me is true, this hospital is going to face serious consequences. It's all true, Sarah. Every word. They spent the evening conducting interviews. Sarah talked to Eugene Patterson, Mary Whitmore, Linda Chen, and a dozen other patients and family members who had stories to tell. She documented bruises, recorded statements, and gathered the kind of evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. By midnight, the story was taking shape. Sarah called her editor and convinced him to put it on the front page of the next day's paper. She also reached out to contacts at local television stations, who began preparing their own coverage. Marcus stayed with his father through the night, watching over him, while the security guards maintained their posts outside the door. Walter woke up around 2 in the morning, confused at first, then understanding. "You're really doing this," he said, "taking on the whole hospital." "Someone has to." Walter was quiet for a long moment. "I never told you this, but I was proud of you. When you became a SEAL, I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Dad, we don't have to do this now." "Yes, we do, because I might not get another chance." Walter reached out and took his son's hand. "I wasn't a good father. I know that. The things I saw in Korea, they broke something in me. And I took that broken thing out on you and your sister and your mother. I've spent my whole life regretting it. Dad, let me finish. I'm sorry, Marcus, for all of it. For the times I was hard on you when you needed me to be soft. For the times I was cold when you needed warmth. For the years we lost because I was too stubborn to say these words." Tears were rolling down Marcus's cheeks now, hot and uncontrollable. "I forgive you, Dad. I forgave you a long time ago. I don't deserve that. Maybe not. But you're my father, and forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about letting go. It's about choosing love over anger, hope over bitterness. Mom taught me that." Walter smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. "Your mother was the best of us. I didn't deserve her either. She loved you, Dad. Despite everything, she loved you until the end. I know, and I wasted so many years not telling her what she meant to me. Don't make the same mistakes I made, son. Don't wait until it's too late to say the things that matter." They held hands in the darkness, 2 soldiers who had finally found their way back to each other. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, the story hit the news at 6 in the morning. Sarah's article in the Richmond Times-Dispatch was devastating, a meticulously researched exposé that named names and provided irrefutable evidence of systematic abuse at Mercy General Hospital. Within hours, it had been picked up by national outlets, and the hospital was under siege by reporters, camera crews, and angry citizens. Marcus watched it all unfold from his father's room, where he and Rebecca had been joined by a growing crowd of family members from other patients. They watched the television as news anchors discussed the story, as interviews with victims were broadcast to millions of viewers. Richard Harmon appeared on camera looking haggard and defensive, reading a prepared statement about the hospital's commitment to patient care. He was immediately replaced by a reporter who detailed the numerous complaints that had been filed and ignored, the pattern of abuse that stretched back years. By noon, the state health department had launched an investigation. By evening, the FBI had opened a case. Patricia Hendricks had been arrested, along with 2 other nurses who had been implicated in the abuse. But the most powerful moment came late in the afternoon, when a group of veterans gathered outside the hospital. They were old men and women, most of them in wheelchairs or using walkers, but they stood together in solidarity with their fallen comrades. One of them, a 92-year-old World War II veteran named Harold Morrison, addressed the cameras with a voice that shook with emotion but refused to break. "We served our country when it needed us. We went to war. We sacrificed. We lost friends. All we ask in return is to be treated with dignity in our final days. What happened at this hospital is a betrayal of everything we fought for. And we will not be silent." Marcus watched the speech from his father's room, his arm around Walter's shoulders. The old man was crying, something Marcus had never seen him do before. "They're standing up," Walter whispered. "After all these years, they're still standing up. That's what soldiers do, Dad. We never stop fighting for what's right." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus became the face of the movement, giving interviews to news outlets from around the world, testifying before state legislators, working with advocacy groups to push for stronger protections for elderly patients. The investigation expanded beyond Mercy General, revealing similar patterns of abuse at nursing homes and long-term care facilities across the state. A new law was proposed, named the Walter Cole Act, that would require mandatory reporting of elder abuse, increased staffing requirements, and harsher penalties for abusers. Through it all, Marcus stayed by his father's side. Their relationship, broken for so long, began to heal in the most unexpected ways. They talked about the past, about the things that had driven them apart. They shared stories and memories and regrets. Walter told Marcus about Korea for the first time, about the friends he'd lost in the frozen hills around the Chosun Reservoir, about the nightmares that had followed him home. He spoke of the guilt he carried, the faces of men he couldn't save, the weight of decisions made in the chaos of combat. "I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would go away," Walter said one evening as the sun set over the city. "But it never did. It just festered, turned into something toxic. And I poisoned everyone around me with it." Marcus told his father about his own experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, about the weight of command and the cost of survival. For the first time, they understood each other not just as father and son, but as soldiers who had seen the worst of humanity and struggled to find their way back. They discovered that they were more alike than either of them had realized. 2 men, shaped by war, struggling to find peace in a world that often seemed designed to deny it. But Walter's condition continued to deteriorate. The heart failure that had brought him to Mercy General was relentless, and the doctors warned that time was running short. They offered treatments that might extend his life by weeks or months, but Walter refused. "I've had a good life," he told Marcus one evening as the sun set over the city. "Not always a happy one, but a good one. I served my country, raised a family, and now I've got to see my son become a hero. That's enough for any man." "You're the hero, Dad. You're the one who spoke up when no one else would." Walter smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "We're both heroes, son, and that's enough." 2 weeks after the story broke, Mercy General Hospital announced that it was shutting down its long-term care wing, pending a complete investigation and restructuring. Richard Harmon resigned in disgrace, facing criminal charges for his role in covering up the abuse. Patricia Hendricks pleaded guilty to multiple counts of assault and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Walter Cole Act passed the state legislature with unanimous support and was signed into law by the governor in a ceremony that Marcus attended with his father, who was wheeled into the state capitol to a standing ovation from legislators and advocates. It was, perhaps, the proudest moment of Walter's life. As cameras flashed and applause filled the chamber, he looked up at his son with eyes that glistened with tears and pride. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Marcus knelt beside his father's wheelchair and took his hand. "Thank you, Dad, for never giving up, for teaching me what it means to fight for what's right." They stayed like that for a long moment, father and son, two old soldiers who had finally found their peace. Walter Cole passed away 3 weeks later, surrounded by his children, his grandchildren, and the friends he had made during his final battle. He died peacefully, in his sleep, with a smile on his face. At his funeral, the honor guard fired a 21-gun salute, and a bugler played taps as the flag was folded and presented to Marcus. Veterans from across the state attended, many of them survivors of the abuse at Mercy General, all of them grateful for the man who had stood up when standing was hard. Marcus spoke at the service, his voice steady, despite the grief that weighed on his heart. "My father was not a perfect man. He would be the first to tell you that, but he was a brave man, a good man, and in the end, a hero. He spent his final days fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, demanding dignity for those who had been stripped of it. That is his legacy. That is what we must carry forward." After the service, Marcus stood alone at his father's grave, watching as the last visitors departed. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery, and a light breeze carried the scent of spring flowers. He thought about all the things they'd never had a chance to say, all the years they'd lost to anger and pride. But he also thought about the weeks they'd shared at the end, the conversations that had healed old wounds, the forgiveness that had set them both free. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he whispered. "I promise." He walked away as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. Behind him, the American flag on Walter's grave fluttered gently in the breeze, a silent testament to a life well lived and a battle well fought. The story didn't end with Walter's passing. In the months that followed, Marcus continued his work advocating for elderly patients and veterans. He founded the Walter Cole Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to preventing elder abuse and ensuring dignity in end-of-life care. He visited hospitals and nursing homes across the country, training staff in proper care techniques and warning them about the consequences of abuse. He spoke at conferences and testified before Congress, pushing for federal legislation that would build on the success of the Walter Cole Act. And he never forgot the people who had stood with him at Mercy General. Eugene Patterson, Mary Whitmore, Robert Chen, and dozens of others who had shared their stories and demanded justice. He visited them regularly, brought them gifts and companionship, made sure they knew they weren't alone. Sarah Mitchell won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the Mercy General scandal. She used the platform to continue investigating elder abuse, uncovering similar patterns at facilities across the country. Her work led to dozens of prosecutions and saved countless lives. Rebecca Cole became an advocate in her own right, speaking about the importance of family involvement in elder care. She established a support group for family members of abuse survivors, helping them navigate the emotional and legal challenges they faced. And the veterans, the old soldiers and sailors and airmen who had fought for their country and demanded dignity in return, became symbols of a movement that stretched far beyond Richmond, Virginia. They reminded America that its greatest generation deserved better, that the men and women who had sacrificed so much should be honored in their final days. Marcus thought about them often, especially on quiet evenings when the weight of his work pressed down on him. He thought about their courage, their resilience, their refusal to be silent in the face of injustice. And he thought about his father, Walter Cole, the hard man who had softened in his final days, who had found the strength to stand up one last time and demand that the world do better. Years later, when people asked Marcus about his work, about why he fought so hard for people he'd never met, he always gave the same answer. Because someone once told me, that's what soldiers do. We never stop fighting for what's right. It was a lesson he'd learned from his father in the end, and it was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The spring morning broke clear and warm over Arlington National Cemetery, with the kind of soft light that seemed to honor the sacred ground below. Marcus Cole stood before his father's headstone, fresh flowers in his hands, as birds sang in the ancient oaks that lined the paths. It had been a year since Walter's passing, a year of victories and setbacks, of hope and heartbreak. The Walter Cole Act had spread to 15 states now, and federal legislation was making its way through Congress, but there was still so much work to be done. Marcus knelt down and placed the flowers at the base of the headstone. The marble was cold beneath his fingers, but he let his hand rest there for a moment, feeling connected to the man buried below. "I met someone, Dad," he said quietly. "Her name is Elena. She's a nurse, believe it or not. A good one. The kind you deserved. I think you would have liked her." He smiled at the thought. Elena Rodriguez had come into his life 6 months ago, a trauma nurse who had read about his work and reached out to volunteer. She was fierce and compassionate and had no patience for bureaucracy or excuses. She reminded Marcus in many ways of his mother. "Rebecca had another baby, a boy. They named him Walter after you. He's got your eyes, Dad. That same stubborn look." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and Marcus felt something settle in his chest. Peace, maybe, or acceptance, or simply the knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I'm still fighting, Dad. Every day. Sometimes it feels like I'm trying to push back an ocean, but then I meet someone like Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter, who told me her grandfather died knowing that someone cared about him, or Mr. Chen's son, who said his father smiled for the first time in years when he saw the news coverage." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Those moments make it worth it. Every frustration, every setback, every night when I wonder if any of this matters, because it does matter. Every life we save, every abuse we prevent, every family we help, it all matters." He stood up slowly, his knees protesting after too long in one position. The cemetery was filling up now, with visitors paying their respects to fallen heroes. Marcus nodded to a few familiar faces, other family members of veterans who had come to remember. "I have to go, Dad. There's a hearing in Washington tomorrow. More testimony, more fighting. But I'll be back. I always come back." He pressed his hand to the headstone one last time, feeling the warmth of the sun on the marble. "I love you, Dad, and I'm proud of you. Prouder than I ever knew how to say." He walked away through the rows of white headstones, each one marking a life of service and sacrifice. The weight of their presence was humbling, a reminder of the debt that could never be fully repaid. At the entrance to the cemetery, Elena was waiting for him. She wore a simple dress and had her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. When she saw him, she smiled that smile that always made him feel like he'd come home. "How was it?" she asked. "Good. Hard, but good." She took his hand, and they walked together toward the parking lot. In the distance, the monuments of Washington gleamed in the morning light, symbols of a nation built on ideals that were worth fighting for. "Ready for tomorrow?" Elena asked. Marcus thought about the hearing, about the senators he would face, about the arguments he would make. He thought about the veterans who were counting on him, the families who had trusted him with their stories. "Ready as I'll ever be." They drove toward the city, the road ahead stretching out before them like a promise. There would be more battles to fight, more obstacles to overcome, more moments when the task seemed impossible. But Marcus had learned something in the past year, something his father had tried to teach him his whole life. The fight was never really about winning. It was about showing up. It was about standing for something. It was about being the person that others could count on when everything else fell apart. Walter Cole had been that person at the end of his life, and Marcus was determined to honor that legacy every single day. The congressional hearing was held in a wood-paneled room that smelled of history and bureaucracy. Marcus sat at a long table facing a row of senators, their faces alternating between bored, skeptical, and occasionally sympathetic. He had done this before, many times now. The nerves that had plagued him at his first hearing had given way to a focused calm. He knew his material, knew his story, knew why he was there. "Mr. Cole," said Senator Margaret Williams, the committee chair, "you've been advocating for the Elder Protection Act for over a year now. Some of my colleagues believe that existing laws are sufficient to address the concerns you've raised. How would you respond to that?" Marcus leaned toward the microphone. "Senator, I would respond by telling them about my father. Walter Cole was a Korean War veteran who served his country with distinction. When he was admitted to a long-term care facility at 94 years old, he believed he would be treated with the dignity he had earned. Instead, he was abused, neglected, and silenced." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The existing laws didn't protect him. The existing regulations didn't prevent a nurse from slapping him across the face. The existing oversight didn't catch the pattern of abuse that had been going on for years at that facility. So, with all due respect, Senator, existing laws are not sufficient. We need stronger protections, better enforcement, and harsher penalties for those who prey on our most vulnerable citizens. The hearing continued for 3 more hours, with Marcus answering questions, providing evidence, and sharing stories from the survivors he had met over the past year. By the end, several senators had tears in their eyes, and even the skeptics seemed moved. It would take another 6 months, but the Elder Protection Act would eventually pass. It would establish federal standards for long-term care facilities, create a national hotline for reporting abuse, and increase funding for investigations and prosecutions. It was not a perfect solution. No law could be, but it was progress. It was a step toward the world that Walter Cole had imagined in his final days, and for Marcus, that was enough. Life settled into a new rhythm after the law passed. Marcus continued his work with the foundation, but he also made time for the things that mattered: his relationship with Elena, his bond with Rebecca and her growing family, his visits to the veterans who had become like extended family. He learned to find joy in small moments, in morning coffee with Elena and weekend barbecues with his nephews and nieces. He learned that healing was not a destination but a journey, that the work of becoming whole again was never truly finished, and he learned that his father had given him a gift in the end. Not just the legacy of the Walter Cole Act, but something more personal, more profound, the gift of forgiveness, the gift of connection, the gift of knowing that it was never too late to reach across the distance and find your way back to the people who mattered. On the 2nd anniversary of Walter's passing, Marcus returned to Arlington with Elena by his side. They stood before the headstone as the sun set over the cemetery, casting long shadows across the hallowed ground. "Thank you, Dad," Marcus said quietly. "For everything." Elena squeezed his hand, and together they watched as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. They walked away as night fell over Arlington, leaving behind the man who had taught them both what it meant to fight for something bigger than themselves. The work would continue, the battles would rage on. But in that moment, standing under a canopy of stars, Marcus Cole felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. 3 years after the events at Mercy General Hospital, Marcus Cole stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. The room was filled with hundreds of people, dignitaries, advocates, survivors, and their families, all gathered for the annual Walter Cole Foundation Gala. Elena sat at a table near the front, her eyes shining with pride. Beside her was Rebecca, now the Foundation's executive director, and her husband Tom, along with their 3 children, including little Walter, who at 2 years old was already showing the stubborn determination of his namesake. Marcus looked out at the crowd and felt a swell of emotion. So much had changed since that rainy morning when he'd sat in his truck outside Mercy General, trying to find the courage to face his dying father. 5 years ago, he began, I was a man without a purpose. I had spent 20 years as a Navy SEAL, serving my country in ways I couldn't talk about and places I couldn't name. When I retired, I didn't know who I was anymore. I drifted. I isolated myself. I lost touch with the people who mattered most. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Then I got a call from my sister. My father was dying and he was asking for me. I almost didn't go. My father and I had been estranged for years, our relationship broken by things neither of us knew how to fix. But something told me I needed to be there. Something told me this was my last chance. He told the story then, the story that had been told 100 times but never lost its power. The abuse, the cover-up, the moment when he walked into his father's room and saw a nurse strike a 94-year-old man across the face. In that moment, everything changed. Not just for my father, not just for the other patients at that hospital, but for me. I realized that all the training I had received, all the skills I had developed, all the experiences I had survived, they weren't just for war. They were for this, for standing up when others couldn't, for speaking out when others were silenced, for fighting battles that needed to be fought. He looked at Elena, who smiled encouragement. My father passed away 3 years ago, but his legacy lives on in this foundation, in the laws we've helped pass, in the thousands of lives we've touched. He showed me that it's never too late to make a difference, that the battles that matter most are often the ones we fight at the end of our lives. That dignity is not a privilege to be earned, but a right to be protected. He raised his glass and the room rose with him. To Walter Cole, soldier, father, hero, may we all have the courage to fight like him. The room erupted in applause, and Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. He didn't try to hide them. He had learned that tears were not weakness, but strength, the visible evidence of a heart that still knew how to feel. After the gala, Marcus and Eleanor walked through Central Park, the city lights twinkling around them like earthbound stars. They didn't speak for a while, content to simply be together in the quiet beauty of the night. You did good tonight, Elena finally said. We did good. All of us. She stopped and turned to face him, her eyes serious. Marcus, I need to tell you something. His heart skipped. What is it? A slow smile spread across her face. I'm pregnant. For a moment Marcus couldn't speak. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her tight, feeling the warmth of her body against his, the steady beat of her heart. We're having a baby, he whispered. We're having a baby. They stood there in the middle of Central Park, two people who had found each other against all odds, about to bring new life into a world they were working to make better. Marcus thought about his father, about the years they had lost and the weeks they had gained. He thought about the lessons Walter had taught him at the end, about forgiveness and fighting, and the things that really mattered. If it's a boy, he said, I want to name him Walter. Eleanor laughed. Your nephew is already named Walter. Then we'll have 2 Walters. The world can always use more Walters. She kissed him then, there under the stars, and Marcus Cole felt something he had spent his whole life searching for. Home. The work continued as it always would. There were more battles to fight, more injustices to expose, more lives to save. But Marcus approached it differently now, with the knowledge that the fight was not his alone. He had Elena, who stood beside him through every challenge. He had Rebecca, who had become his partner in purpose. He had the veterans, survivors, advocates, and volunteers who made up the Walter Cole Foundation family. And he had his father, whose spirit lived on in every life they touched, every law they passed, every moment of dignity they preserved. 6 months after the gala, Marcus and Eleanor welcomed a son into the world. They named him Daniel Walter Cole, after Eleanor's grandfather and Marcus's father. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin, and from the moment Marcus first held him, he knew that everything he had done had been worth it. He stood in the hospital room, cradling his newborn son, as Elena watched with exhausted joy. Through the window, he could see the city waking up, a world full of challenges and possibilities. "I'm going to tell you stories about your grandfather," Marcus whispered to Daniel, "about how he fought in the snow in Korea and never gave up. About how he stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. About how he taught your dad what it means to be a man." Daniel made a soft sound, and Marcus smiled. "But most of all, I'm going to tell you that it's never too late. No matter how far you've wandered, no matter how broken things seem, it's never too late to find your way back. That's what your grandfather taught me in the end, and that's what I'm going to teach you." He looked out the window at the rising sun, at the golden light spilling over the city, and felt a peace he had never known before. The journey was not over. It would never be over. But for the first time in his life, Marcus Cole was ready for whatever came next. Because he had learned the secret that his father had carried through 94 years of life and struggle and redemption. The secret that made all the difference. The battles we fight for others are the ones that save ourselves. And in fighting for his father, Marcus had finally found his way home. 10 years had passed since the events at Mercy General Hospital. Marcus Cole stood on the porch of his farmhouse in the Shenandoah Valley, watching his son Daniel chase fireflies across the meadow in the fading light of a summer evening. At 52, Marcus had finally made peace with his body's limitations. The limp that had plagued him since Fallujah was more pronounced now, and his hair had gone silver at the temples. But his eyes were clear, and his heart was full. Elena came out to join him, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed him one and settled into the chair beside him, her hair now streaked with grey, but her spirit undimmed. "He's got your energy," she said, watching Daniel leap and spin in pursuit of the glowing insects. "Poor kid," she laughed. "He could do worse." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play as the stars began to emerge. The foundation had grown beyond anything Marcus had imagined, with chapters in every state and partnerships with organizations around the world. The Walter Cole Act had been strengthened 3 times, and elder abuse rates had dropped by 40% nationwide. But Marcus had stepped back from the day-to-day operations years ago, handing the reins to a new generation of advocates. He still spoke at events, still consulted on difficult cases, still lent his name and reputation to causes that mattered. But his primary focus now was his family, his community, and the quiet work of building a life that honored the lessons his father had taught him. Rebecca visited often with her family, and the cousins had become inseparable. Little Walter, now 12, had inherited his namesake's stubborn streak and was already talking about joining the Marines. Marcus didn't discourage him. Some callings couldn't be denied. Daniel ran up to the porch, his hands cupped around a single firefly. "Dad, look! I caught one!" Marcus knelt down to see, marveling at the soft glow between his son's fingers. "That's beautiful, buddy. What are you going to do with it?" Daniel thought for a moment, then opened his hands and let the firefly go. They watched it rise into the darkness, joining its fellows in their ancient dance. "Why'd you let it go?" Marcus asked. "Because it's prettier when it's free." Marcus felt his heart swell with pride. His son understood something that had taken him decades to learn. Some things were more beautiful when you let them go. Grudges, fears, the need to control everything. "That's right, buddy. That's exactly right." He scooped Daniel up in his arms, ignoring the protest from his bad leg, and carried him inside. Elena followed, and together they settled on the couch for their evening ritual of reading and stories. Later that night, after Daniel was asleep and the house was quiet, Marcus walked out to the barn where he kept his father's old footlocker. He hadn't opened it in years, but tonight felt right. Inside were the artifacts of Walter Cole's life, his Korean War medals, still bright and proud, His discharge papers, yellowed with age, a bundle of letters tied with string, written to Dorothy during the war, full of longing and hope and the careful optimism of a young man who didn't know if he would survive. And at the bottom, a photograph. Walter and Marcus, taken when Marcus was 10 years old, standing in front of the house where he grew up. Walter's hand was on his son's shoulder, and both of them were smiling. Marcus didn't remember the moment, didn't remember ever being that happy with his father. But here was proof that it had happened, that there had been a time before the distance and the anger, when they had simply been a father and son who loved each other. He held the photograph for a long time, feeling the weight of all the years that had followed. Then he carried it inside and placed it on his nightstand, where he could see it every morning when he woke up. "Good night, Dad," he whispered. "Thank you for everything." He climbed into bed beside Eleanor, who stirred and reached for him in her sleep. He held her close and closed his eyes, letting the peace of the night wash over him. Outside, the fireflies continued their dance, points of light in the darkness, each one a small beacon of hope. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of his son's laughter drifting up from downstairs. He smiled and stretched, feeling the familiar aches and pains that came with age, then made his way down to the kitchen. Elena was making pancakes, while Daniel sat at the table, regaling her with stories from his dreams. Marcus kissed them both and poured himself a cup of coffee, taking his usual spot by the window. "Dad," Daniel said, "tell me a story about Grandpa Walter." Marcus looked at his son, at the curiosity in his eyes, and felt a surge of love that never got old. "Which story do you want to hear? The one about how he stood up for the other veterans? The one where you helped him?" Marcus smiled. It was a story he had told many times, but it never lost its power. Because it wasn't just a story about his father. It was a story about what ordinary people could do when they refused to stay silent. It was a story about dignity and justice and the bonds that hold families together. It was a story about hope. "Okay," he said, settling into his chair. "It started on a rainy morning when I drove to the hospital to see a man I hadn't talked to in 3 years, and as the morning sun filled the kitchen with golden light, Marcus Cole told his son the story of Walter Cole, hero of the chosen reservoir and champion of the forgotten, the story of a father and son who had found their way back to each other at the end, the story that had changed everything." Daniel listened with wide eyes, as he always did, and when the story was over, he climbed into his father's lap and hugged him tight. "I want to be like Grandpa Walter when I grow up," he said. "I want to help people." Marcus held his son close and felt tears prick at his eyes. "You already are, buddy. You already are." Outside, the sun rose over the Shenandoah Valley, casting long shadows across the meadow where the fireflies had danced the night before. A new day was beginning, full of possibilities and challenges, and the endless work of building a better world. But in that kitchen, in that moment, all that mattered was a father and son, bound by love and legacy, carrying forward the lessons of the man who had shown them both what it meant to fight for what was right. The story of Walter Cole would live on, not just in laws and foundations and speeches, but in the hearts of those who remembered, in the lives they touched, in the battles they fought, in the hope they carried into each new day. And somewhere in a place beyond time and understanding, Walter Cole watched over his family with pride. His journey was complete. His legacy was secure. His love endured. The warrior had found his peace, and his son had found his purpose. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Years continued to pass, as years do. Marcus watched his son grow into a young man, watched him choose his own path, watched him carry forward the legacy that had been entrusted to him. Daniel didn't become a soldier. Instead, he became a nurse, drawn to the work of healing by the stories his father had told him. He specialized in geriatric care, working in the very hospital where his grandfather had suffered and eventually triumphed. The irony was not lost on Marcus. The place that had once been a symbol of everything wrong with the system had been transformed, through years of hard work and vigilance, into a model of compassionate care. And now, his son was part of that transformation. "Grandpa would be proud," Daniel said one evening, when he came home to visit and found his father sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies as he had done so many times before. "He would," Marcus agreed. "He'd probably say something gruff about it, but inside he'd be proud." Daniel laughed. "I wish I could have known him." "You do know him. Every time you care for a patient, every time you stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, you're carrying his spirit forward. That's how we know the people we've lost, through the work we do in their name." They sat together in comfortable silence, father and son, as the stars emerged above them. Somewhere in the darkness, a whippoorwill called, its song mixing with the chirp of crickets and the rustle of wind through the trees. "Dad," Daniel said eventually, "do you ever think about all the people Grandpa's story has helped? All the lives that were changed because you stood up that day?" Marcus considered the question. He thought about the thousands of emails and letters he had received over the years, from families who had been helped by the foundation, from survivors who had found their voices, from caregivers who had been inspired to do better. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "but I try not to think about it too much. Because the moment you start counting the impact, you start expecting something in return. And that's not why we do it." "Why do we do it then?" Marcus looked at his son, at the earnest question in his eyes, and felt the weight of all the years and all the lessons they had carried. "Because it's right," he said simply. "Because when we see injustice, we have a choice. We can look away or we can stand up, and every time we stand up we make the world a little bit better, not for thanks or recognition or legacy, just because it's right." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "Grandpa taught you that?" "In the end, yes. He taught me that the most important battles are the ones nobody sees. The daily choices to be kind, to be fair, to treat people with dignity, those are the battles that really matter." They talked late into the night about Walter and Dorothy, about Elena and Rebecca, about all the people who had shaped their family's story. And when Daniel finally drove back to the city, Marcus sat alone on the porch, feeling the peace of a life well lived. He was 72 years old now, and his body was failing in the slow, inevitable way that bodies do. But his mind was clear, and his heart was full, and he knew that when his time came, he would face it without fear, because he had learned the lesson that his father had taught him in those final weeks at Mercy General Hospital, the lesson that had changed everything. We are not defined by our wounds, but by how we heal them. We are not measured by our failures, but by how we rise from them. We are not remembered for the years we lived, but for the lives we touched. And in the end, the only thing that matters is love. The love we give, the love we receive, the love we carry forward from generation to generation, lighting the way through the darkness. Marcus closed his eyes and let the night embrace him. Somewhere above, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, ancient and enduring and full of mystery. And in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, a sound of journeys beginning and ending, of travelers moving toward destinations known and unknown. The warrior was at peace. His story was complete. But the story of those he loved would continue, carrying his legacy forward into a future he could only imagine. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. On a spring morning 5 years later, Elena Cole woke to find that her husband had passed peacefully in his sleep. He was 77 years old, and his face bore the serene expression of a man who had made his peace with the world. She held his hand and wept, not from sorrow alone, but from gratitude for the years they had shared, the life they had built, the love that had sustained them through every challenge and triumph. Daniel came immediately when she called, followed by Rebecca and her family, and together they gathered in the farmhouse to remember the man who had meant so much to them all. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery, where Marcus was buried beside his father. The honor guard fired a 21-gun salute, and a bugler played taps as the flag was folded and presented to Elena. Veterans came from across the country to pay their respects. Men and women who had been touched by Marcus's advocacy, families who had been helped by the foundation he had built. They stood in rows, some in wheelchairs, some leaning on walkers, all of them united by the bond of service and sacrifice. Daniel spoke at the service, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "My father taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite the fear. He taught me that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice we make every day to show up for the people who need us. He taught me that legacy isn't about monuments or laws or recognition. It's about the lives we touch, the hope we kindle, the light we leave behind." He paused, looking out at the crowd of mourners. "My father was a warrior, but his greatest battle wasn't fought with weapons. It was fought with compassion, with persistence, with the stubborn refusal to accept injustice, and in that battle he was victorious, because the world is better for his having been in it, and that's all any of us can hope for." After the service, Elena and Daniel stood together at Marcus's grave, watching as the last visitors departed. The sun was setting over Arlington, casting long shadows across the rows of white headstones. "He's with Grandpa now," Daniel said. Elena nodded, her eyes wet, but her heart at peace. "They have a lot of catching up to do." They stood there until the stars began to appear, honoring the man who had brought them together, who had taught them what it meant to love and fight and hope. And when they finally walked away, the night embracing them like an old friend, they knew that Marcus Cole's story was not ending. It was being carried forward, in the foundation that bore his father's name, in the laws they had helped pass, in the lives they had touched, in the hearts of everyone who had ever been inspired to stand up when standing was hard, in the legacy of love that would endure long after they were all gone. The warrior was home, his family would carry on, and the light he had kindled would never go out. It would burn on, from generation to generation, a beacon of hope in a world that so desperately needed it. A reminder that one person could make a difference, that it was never too late to stand up for what was right, that love, in the end, was always the answer, always and forever. 20 years after the events at Mercy General Hospital, the Walter Cole Foundation had become one of the largest elder advocacy organizations in the country. Its headquarters occupied a renovated building in downtown Richmond, just blocks from the hospital where everything had started. Daniel Cole, now 45 years old, stood in the lobby of the foundation, surrounded by photographs that told the story of 2 decades of progress. There was his grandfather Walter in his military uniform, young and proud. There was his father Marcus, speaking at the Capitol. And there were hundreds of others, the survivors and advocates who had made this work possible. It was the 20th anniversary of the Walter Cole Act, and people had come from across the country to celebrate. Former patients from Mercy General had traveled to share their stories. Families who had lost loved ones to elder abuse had come to honor their memory. Daniel walked through the crowd, shaking hands with people who had become like family over the years. He saw Linda Chen, Robert's daughter, who had taken over the foundation's legal program. He saw Sarah Mitchell, now retired but still sharp as ever. And he saw his mother, Elena, now in her late 70s, but still radiating the fierce compassion that had drawn his father to her. She sat near the stage, surrounded by her grandchildren, Daniel's children. "Dad would have loved this," Daniel said, taking a seat beside her. "He would have hated the attention," Elena replied with a knowing smile, "but he would have loved seeing everyone together. He always said the work was about the people, not the recognition. That's what made him special. That's what made both of them special, your father and your grandfather." They understood that real change happens one person at a time, one act of courage at a time. Daniel thought about his grandfather, a man he had never met, but felt he knew through the stories his father had told him. He thought about the choices Walter Cole had made in those final weeks of his life, and he thought about his father, who had turned a moment of horror into a movement of hope. "I think about them every day," Daniel said. "When I'm with a patient, when I'm training new nurses, I think about what they would want me to do." "And what do they tell you?" "To be kind, to be brave, to never forget that every person deserves dignity, no matter how old or sick or forgotten they might seem." Elena reached out and took his hand. "They would be so proud of you, Daniel." Both of them. The ceremony began a few minutes later. Daniel took the stage and looked out at the assembled crowd, at the faces of people who had been touched by his family's story, who had found hope in the midst of despair, who had discovered that they were not alone in their struggles. 20 years ago," he began, "my father walked into a hospital room and found his 94-year-old father being abused by a nurse. In that moment, he could have looked away. He could have filed a complaint and hoped for the best. He could have accepted a settlement and moved on with his life." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "But that's not who Marcus Cole was, and that's not who his father, Walter Cole, raised him to be. Instead of looking away, they stood up. Instead of accepting injustice, they fought back. Instead of settling for the world as it was, they worked to build the world as it should be." He told the story then, the story that had become legend, the story that had inspired millions of people to demand better for their parents and grandparents. He told them about the fear in his grandfather's eyes and the fury in his father's heart. He told them about the journalist who had risked her career to tell the truth. He told them about the veterans who had stood together outside the hospital, old and frail but unbroken, their voices raised in solidarity with their fallen comrades. And he told them about the love that had sustained it all, the love between a father and son who had found each other at the end, the love between a man and a woman who had built a life together, the love between strangers who had become family through their shared commitment to a cause greater than themselves. "The Walter Cole Act has saved countless lives," Daniel said. "It has changed the way we think about elder care, the way we treat our most vulnerable citizens, the way we honor those who have served our country. But laws are just words on paper. What really matters is the spirit behind them, the commitment to dignity and justice that gives them meaning." He looked at his mother, who was wiping tears from her eyes. He looked at Linda Chen, who nodded with quiet pride. He looked at the veterans in the front row, some of them survivors of Mercy General, all of them living testaments to the power of courage and compassion. "My grandfather didn't set out to change the world. He just wanted to be treated with respect. My father didn't set out to lead a movement. He just wanted to protect the people he loved. But sometimes the smallest acts of courage can ripple outward in ways we never imagine. Sometimes standing up for one person can mean standing up for millions." He raised his glass, just as his father had done at countless events over the years. "To Walter Cole and Marcus Cole, to the veterans they championed and the families they helped, to everyone who has ever stood up when standing was hard. May we carry their legacy forward, today and every day, until every person in this country is treated with the dignity they deserve." The room erupted in applause, and Daniel felt the presence of his father and grandfather beside him, watching over him, guiding him forward. After the ceremony, he walked outside and stood in the cool evening air. The sun was setting over Richmond, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. In the distance, he could see the outline of Mercy General Hospital, transformed now into a model of compassionate care, a living memorial to the men and women who had fought for change. His daughter, Sarah, named after the journalist who had helped break the story all those years ago, came to stand beside him. She was 18 years old, about to start college, already talking about going into healthcare advocacy. "That was a beautiful speech, Dad," she said. "Thanks, sweetheart. I've been thinking a lot about Great-Grandpa Walter and Grandpa Marcus lately, about what they did and why they did it. And what have you concluded?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I think they understood something that a lot of people don't, that the world doesn't change on its own, that somebody has to push it, has to fight for it, has to be willing to sacrifice for it. And that the people who do that, the ones who stand up when everyone else is sitting down, they're the ones who make history." Daniel smiled, feeling pride swell in his chest. His daughter understood. The legacy would continue. "Your great-grandfather used to say that being a soldier wasn't about following orders or carrying a weapon. It was about protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, about standing between the innocent and the wolves that would devour them. Is that why Grandpa Marcus called them warriors?" "That's exactly why. Because they were. Not the kind of warriors who fight with guns and bombs, but the kind who fight with courage and compassion, the kind who refuse to let injustice go unchallenged, the kind who believe that every life matters, no matter how old or forgotten." Sarah leaned her head against her father's shoulder. "I want to be that kind of warrior, Dad." "You already are, sweetheart. You already are." They stood together in the fading light, watching the stars emerge one by one, Walter Cole and Marcus Cole, Dorothy and Elena, all the veterans and survivors who had found their voices. The story was not over. It would never be over, because as long as there were people willing to stand up, willing to speak out, willing to fight for what was right, the legacy of the Coles would live on, in the hearts of those who remembered, in the lives of those they had touched, in the hope that burned eternal, passed from generation to generation, a flame that could never be extinguished. That was the true meaning of legacy, one act of courage at a time, one person at a time, one day at a time, forever and always.